Imagine you're in the market for your very first home. You're worried about your credit score, your household income, and affording a down payment. Now imagine also having to worry about being approved based on your race. Unfortunately, that was the reality for many non-white Americans in the 1900s. Housing deeds dictate what people can and cannot do with a piece of land. Throughout the 1900s, clauses called racial covenants were often added to these housing deeds, and these racial covenants outlined who could occupy the land. In practice, racial covenants were used to generate and enforce segregation.
I would describe racial covenants as these clauses that were in real estate deeds up until 1968 on a legal basis. And these clauses would either state the ethnic groups that people were permitted to sell property to, or the ethnic groups that people were prohibited from selling the property to.
They're a very important mechanism to understand for how segregation operated legally in American history, in every community in the United States. But it was also just one way in which segregation and discrimination happened. There was also the practice of redlining, in which the federal government identified particular neighborhoods as undesirable, and those would have been neighborhoods that were occupied or where African Americans, particular immigrant groups would have lived. People who lived in redline neighborhoods wouldn't have been able to access mortgages, to buy homes, or to buy property. So that was another mechanism of legal segregation. But then there are also other aspects of segregation that worked alongside or in tandem with racial covenants, like steering, in which realtors would not show homes to people of particular racial or ethnic backgrounds. And so that limited choices for home ownership for people looking to buy homes. There were also other practices in the real estate industry in which sellers can learn the identity of people who are buying their homes. This still happens to this day in the St. Cloud area, in which neighborhoods that are historically white, when families who are not white try to buy homes in those neighborhoods, and then the sellers find out, sometimes those sellers will pull out of the sale or attempt to do so, even though that's illegal. There are other forms of discrimination that happen in terms of white flight, in which once cities like St. Cloud become more diverse, then the white or European American population of that area leaves, and taking with them their wealth and their property taxes and everything that goes into creating that community, the resources along with that. And so there are multiple mechanisms, both in the past and in the present, that have led to racial segregation in terms of where people live, how wealth is generated and then passed on to other generations, resources that are available to some groups of people and not to others, and ways that those continue to last into the present.
While it is important to discuss racial covenants and their unfair housing practices, any discussion about how the U.S. deals with land needs to center the voices of Indigenous people who have had their land forcibly taken from them.
So if we think about the development of central Minnesota, it really can only happen through land loss and resources loss for Native people. So if we look at this part of central Minnesota, it kind of has a really interesting history because where we are when we look at Sherburne, Benton, and Stearns County, it's kind of like the intersection of really like 4 different treaties. There's an 1837 treaty with the Dakota, an 1837 treaty with Ojibwe people. There's an 1847 treaty with Ojibwe people and an 1851 treaty with Dakota people. And if we sort of look at where the lands that those treaties encompass, it kind of tends to sort of be in this part of central Minnesota. So we start to see these treaties being negotiated, and I think it's really important for us to understand that Ojibwe and Dakota people who are part of this treaty-making process are not entering into a treaty-making process as equal partners. We tend to think of treaties as like 2 parties sitting together, coming up with an agreement that mutually benefits both parties. And that is really not how treaty-making was done in the United States. The process definitely favors the United States. The process is done in English. using sort of European-style rule of law, using European and English legal language. So essentially, it's favoring the United States and favoring what would be Minnesota very, very strongly. And I think that these kinds of questions and these kinds of topics need to be considered because they are the groundwork that gets to the point where racial covenants can be done. We can't write racial covenants if the land is in the hands of Native people. So how do we get the lands away from Native people so that things like a St. Cloud can be formed?
The existence of racial covenants was not unique to central Minnesota. They became a common feature of many cities in the U.S. in response to the Great Migration, which is the relocation of Southern Blacks to northern and Midwestern cities in the 1900s.
So I think St. Cloud is both typical and unique. It's very typical in how every single place that people have looked for racial covenants in the United States, they have found them. So these are ubiquitous. They would have been used all across the country in the early to mid 20th century. So finding racial covenants in St. Cloud is not a surprise at all. And many of the language of the covenants in St. Cloud is also very typical, that would have been identical to similar covenants that we would see in Minneapolis or Chicago. So in that way, it's not different at all.
Well, I think what makes St. Cloud unique is that, again, the African American population was so small that there was really no need for the European Americans who lived in St. Cloud to feel threatened of any sudden influx of African Americans into the community. Because one thing I know about St. Cloud is that it's one of the few cities in the north to actually have the African population go down during the years of the Negro migration, as it was called back then, from the 1920s to the 1960s. Whereas you have other cities, including the Twin Cities, have an uptick in African American new residents from 1920 to 1960. It goes down in St. Cloud during those same years.
Many wonder how racial covenants were implemented and why they became so common.
The people who put the clauses in the deeds for racial covenants were property developers, people who bought land in the county and who made a determination of the kind of people who they wanted to buy the property. And they made these arrangements with the realtors that you are to sell or even show, let alone sell, this house or this land to these groups only and not these. And if the realtor wanted to have the business of the property developer, then the realtor would have to comply.
They absolutely were a selling point. I mean, it's hard to know exactly what was going through buyers' minds when they were purchasing these properties. But we know that when covenanted neighborhoods were being advertised, they were advertised as restricted. And this was a selling point. And they would use taglines like, our assurance is your insurance, that you have proper restrictions to protect the value of your home. And so people who were buying properties in restricted neighborhoods often knew that they did have racial restrictions as well as other restrictions. And this would have been a source of assurance for property owners who are making the biggest purchase of their lives. And because at this time, many white people in particular thought that having non-white people live in the neighborhood would depress property values, they would have found living in racially homogeneous neighborhoods that would stay that way very attractive.
It is important to reiterate that these racial covenants were extremely common and existed in almost every American community. They were never obscured from the public while they were in effect. Housing developments would often even use these racial covenants as selling points. It is only through understanding this that we can begin to discuss racial covenants in Stearns County specifically.